Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to get into this one.
So picture this for a second.
Yeah.
You're a bird flying over this rocky, ancient meadow. You're relatively small, like a jackdaw, but you've just watched this massive eagle swoop out of the sky.
Right.
It effortlessly snatches up a lamb in its talons and just soars away. And you watch that and think, I could absolutely do that.
I mean, how hard could it be, right?
Exactly. So you find the biggest, heaviest ram in the flock. You go into this steep dive, a great whirring of wings. You slam into the ram's back. Your claws sink deep into the thick wool.
And you are completely stuck.
You're stuck. You can't lift the ram. You can't even fly away. You're just flapping uselessly, totally trapped by your own delusion, basically waiting for the shepherd to come along, laugh at you, and clip your wings.
It's such a brutal image.
It is. And that is exactly where we are starting today. We are taking a massive stack of source material, specifically Aesop's Fables, numbers 151 through 200. And we are extracting the raw, unfiltered, and honestly sometimes brutally harsh wisdom buried inside them.
Yeah, because if you think these are just, cute bedtime stories about talking animals, prepare to have that illusion completely dismantled.
Oh, totally dismantled. Our mission in this deep dive is to look at these texts as highly sophisticated tools for understanding human psychology. We're going to unpack authenticity, the terrifying blind spots we refuse to acknowledge, the deep mechanics of human interdependence, the invisible dangers in our alliances, and the incredibly subjective nature of reality itself.
And I think it is really vital to frame this correctly from the jump, because the historical context of these texts completely rewires how you consume them. We are talking about the ancient Mediterranean world, Greece, Rome.
Right, a very different landscape.
Exactly. A landscape where straightforward political dissent was essentially a death sentence. You didn't just stand in the town square and criticize a tyrant or, a corrupt merchant class unless you wanted to be exiled or executed. Or enslaved, even.
So you had to be clever about it.
You had to be incredibly clever. These stories were born out of a desperate need for survival, moral instruction, and subversive social critique. Using animals as avatars for human flaws provided this brilliant layer of plausible deniability.
Oh, that makes so much sense. So if someone overhears you, you just shrug and say, "What?"
I'm not talking about the emperor hoarding the grain supply. I'm just telling a fun little story about a very greedy lion.
Exactly. It was a coded language for the disenfranchised. And because these fables were forged in such a high-stakes, uncompromising environment, they just do not care about protecting our feelings. They are deeply pragmatic.
Yeah.
They analyze human nature as it actually operates, not how we optimistically wish it would operate. The authors observed the mechanics of human failure and encoded them into these highly memorable, visceral images, which is exactly why they translate so perfectly to the present day. I mean, we aren't dodging ancient emperors, but the psychological traps are identical. In fact, our modern environment might even amplify them.
Oh, for sure.
We have digital platforms completely designed to help us pretend to be things we aren't, which brings us to the first major conceptual block in our stack, the fatal trap of pretension and fighting our own nature.
Right.
The overarching thesis in these specific fables is that you can change your habits, but you cannot change your fundamental nature. Attempting to force an environment or a persona that contradicts your innate capabilities doesn't just lead to mild failure, it actively invites ruin and public ridicule.
And we see the mechanics of this play out so tragically in Fable 151, The Crow and the Swan. We have a crow who becomes entirely consumed by envy over the swan's beautiful white plumage. And look at the logic the crow applies here. He doesn't just wish she was white. He formulates this deeply flawed hypothesis about causality.
He thinks he can hack the system.
Right. He decides that the swan's color must be the result of the water it constantly swims and bathes in. So the crow completely abandons his natural habitat. He leaves the neighborhood of the altars, where he makes an easy, reliable living, scavenging bits of sacrificed meat, and he moves to the pools and streams.
And he puts in the work.
Dang.
Like, the text is clear that the crow is out there bathing and washing his feathers multiple times a day.
Yeah.
He is grinding.
He is.
He's putting in an incredible amount of effort to execute this strategy, but it's fundamentally useless because his hypothesis was wrong. He doesn't get any whiter, and worse, because he's abandoned the environment that actually sustains him, the altars. He starves to death.
Yeah.
He literally starves himself trying to execute a swan's strategy in a swan's environment.
It's a really profound observation about the misallocation of energy. And we see a human parallel in Fable 162, the cobbler turned doctor. We have this unskilled cobbler who's failing at his actual trade. He can't make a living mending boots, but instead of analyzing why he's failing or trying to improve his craft, he simply changes his label.
Just a total rebrand.
A total rebrand. He moves towns, declares himself a physician, and starts selling a universal antidote against all poisons. The fable explicitly notes that he succeeds temporarily because of his, quote, talent for puffing himself. He's a master of ancient public relations.
Wow.
He manipulates the asymmetry of information. The public doesn't understand medicine, so they trust his marketing.
Right up until the system undergoes a stress test. Because the cobbler falls ill, and the king decides to evaluate this famous doctor. The king pours a cup of this supposed antidote, pretends to mix actual poison into it, and commands the cobbler to drink it for a massive reward.
And suddenly the asymmetry of information is gone.
Exactly. The cobbler is faced with a literal life-or-death reality, and his marketing can't save him. Terrified, he instantly confesses that the antidote is fake, and he has zero medical knowledge. And then the king turns to the citizens and delivers this devastating rebuke.
So good.
He says, "What folly could be greater than yours? Here is a man to whom no one will send his boots to be mended, and yet you have not hesitated to entrust him with your lives."
The king's reaction points to the systemic danger of pretension. The cobbler's delusion didn't just risk his own life, it endangered the entire community that bought into his false persona. We see this recurring theme of the environment ultimately stress testing the facade.
Right.
Like in The Monkey and the Camel, Fable 167. The camel tries to mimic a monkey's brilliant, agile dancing to win the applause of the crowd, but his physiology is completely wrong for it. He looks grotesque and the other animals drive him away.
Or Fable 198, the Mule.
Yes.
The mule spends all his time boasting that his father was a high-spirited racehorse, believing he has inherited all that speed and nobility. But when he is finally put into a heavy harness and forced to do long, grueling labor, he ends the day exhausted, admitting, "Well, I must have been mistaken about my father. He can only have been an ass after all." Reality is the ultimate filter.
It really is.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because on the surface, this sounds a lot like the ancient world telling people to stay in their lane. Modern listeners hear the jackdaw failing to carry the ram or the cobbler getting exposed, and it clashes violently with our cultural narrative of aspiration.
Yeah, that's a very fair pushback.
Because we are constantly told to have a growth mindset, to embrace neuroplasticity, to fake it till you make it. If we take Aesop literally here, aren't we just telling people never to attempt anything difficult? What happens to human progress if the crow never tries to improve?
That is the exact tension we need to navigate. What's fascinating here is that to understand this, we have to peel back the layers of ancient sociology. These stories originated in highly stratified societies. The idea of social mobility, like a peasant becoming a king, or even a cobbler becoming a respected scholar, was deeply threatening to the established power structures.
So they baked their politics into it.
But undeniably, yes. There is a layer of ancient social control baked into the text. The elites who repeated these stories absolutely wanted the cobbler to stay a cobbler. However, if we filter out that ancient caste system bias, the enduring psychological insight underneath is not about suppressing growth. It's about the mechanics of grounded self-awareness.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning the fables draw a hard line between healthy aspiration and delusional pretension. Healthy aspiration is anchored in reality. It says, I am a crow. My beak and claws are built for scavenging. How can I become the smartest, most resourceful crow at these altars?
Right, leaning into what you actually are.
Exactly. Delusional pretension ignores reality. It says, I am going to act like a swan until my DNA magically alters. The fables warn that growth must be an extension of your true nature, not a rebellion against it.
That distinction completely changes how we apply this to modern life. Think about modern career paths and leadership. So many people are experiencing deep systemic burnout because they are starving crows trying to live in the swan's pond.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's say you are a naturally introverted, highly analytical, deep-thinking creative. That is your nature. But you look around your industry and you see that the loud, extroverted, charismatic sales leaders are getting all the applause, just like the monkey dancing.
Right.
So you force yourself into that mold. You take a job that requires relentless extroversion. You might even succeed for a while by masking, using your talent for puffing yourself. But the physiological and psychological toll is massive.
The energy required to maintain a persona that contradicts your baseline nature is totally unsustainable. When the king tests you, when a real crisis hits, or just through the sheer attrition of daily labor, the mask slips. The tragedy of the jackdaw isn't just that he failed to catch the ram. The tragedy is that by trying to be an eagle, he lost the freedom of being a jackdaw.
He ends up a captive pet.
He ends up with his wings clipped. When we chase an unnatural standard, we often forfeit the unique advantages our actual nature provides.
Which gives us a very clear, sharp practice to pull from this. For you listening right now, I want you to run an audit on where you are spending your energy. Identify one area in your life, your career, or your relationships, where you are currently stuck in the wool.
Yeah, that's a great way to frame it.
Where are you flapping your wings uselessly, feeling exhausted and trapped? Because you are mimicking someone else's strategy instead of leveraging your own innate capabilities. Where are you trying to wash your feathers in a stream when you should be eating at the altars? Find that area and give yourself permission to let go of the ram. Play the game that you are actually built to win.
That audit of our own capabilities leads us directly to the next critical flaw in human programming. Because just as we miscalculate our internal nature, we are equally terrible at calculating our external environment. We manufacture a profound illusion of control, deliberately choosing blind spots to make ourselves feel safe.
This is one of the most fascinating sections in the Stag, hands down. These fables read like ancient risk management seminars. The central thesis is that misfortune rarely comes from the direction we are actively scaring at. It assails us from an unexpected quarter. False confidence and the arrogant assumption of safety lead straight to ruin.
The imagery Aesop uses to explain this cognitive bias is brilliant. Let's look at Fable 152, the stag with one eye. We have a stag who is completely blind in one eye. He's grazing near the seashore. Now, the stag realizes he has a vulnerability, so he makes what he believes is a highly strategic, rational decision. He positions himself so his good eye is turned inland, watching the fields and the woods, because that is where hounds and hunters traditionally come from. He turns his blind eye toward the sea.
Because his internal logic says the sea is water. Hounds don't live in water. Therefore, the sea is an inherently safe zone. I don't need to look there.
And that assumption is his death warrant. He has completely discounted the sea as a threat vector. As he's standing there, intensely focused on the land, a boat full of sailors comes coasting along the shore. They see this stag standing perfectly still, presenting his broadside to them, completely oblivious to their presence.
Oh, man.
They draw an arrow, shoot him from the boat, and mortally wound him. His dying realization is the core of the fable. He says, "I bethought me of the dangers of the land, but I feared no peril from the sea, yet thence has come my ruin."
It's the ultimate blind spot. And we see a different variation of this failure of awareness in Fable 190, The Astronomer. This fable is actually widely believed to be based on Thales of Miletus, one of the real ancient Greek philosophers.
Right.
The story goes that this astronomer makes a habit of going out every single night to observe the stars. He is walking through the fields, gazing upward, entirely absorbed in tracking the constellations. His mind is focused on the massive, abstract workings of the cosmos. And because he refuses to look at the immediate ground beneath his feet, he walks straight off the edge and plummets into a deep, dry well.
The reaction of the passerby in the story is classic ancient pragmatism. Someone hears the astronomer groaning at the bottom of the well, looks down, and essentially says, if you're going to dedicate all your energy to looking at the sky while remaining totally blind to the ground you walk on, you deserve exactly where you are.
They did not mess around.
No, they did not value theoretical knowledge if it compromised practical survival. We see the danger of ignoring the immediate reality again in Fable 197, The Herdsman and the Lost Bull. A herdsman loses a highly valuable young bull. He searches the entire surrounding area, finds nothing, and in a state of desperation, makes a solemn vow to the gods. Great Jupiter, if I can just discover the thief who took my bull, I will sacrifice a calf to you. He wants certainty. He wants to know exactly who is responsible.
He assumes that finding the answer will resolve his problem.
But he doesn't understand the environment he's operating in. He pushes deeper into a dense thicket and finally finds what he was looking for. A massive, terrifying lion in the middle of devouring his lost bull. The herdsman is suddenly face to face with an apex predator. His entire perspective on what he wants immediately collapses. He throws his hands to heaven again and cries out, Jupiter, I promised you a calf to find the thief, but now I promise you a full-grown bull, if only I can escape unhurt from his clutches.
Be careful what you wish for. Right. He got exactly what he asked for, and it almost killed him. Then we have Fable 186, The Lion and the Hare, which highlights how our blind spots are often created by our own greed.
Yes, this one is great.
A lion comes across a sleeping hare. This is a guaranteed meal. He is just about to strike when he sees a large stag run past. The lion instantly recalculates. He drops the guaranteed immediate sustenance to chase the much larger abstract prize. But the stag is far too fast. After a long, exhausting, failed chase, the lion returns to his original spot, only to find that the hare has woken up and fled. By abandoning the reality in his grasp for an illusion of a better outcome, he ends up with nothing.
If we synthesize the underlying mechanics of these stories, we start to see a profound connection to other ancient philosophical frameworks, specifically Stoicism, which was developing around the same cultural moment. Think about Epictetus and the Stoic concept of the dichotomy of control.
Okay, remind us how that works.
The Stoics argued that human suffering primarily comes from blurring the lines between what is entirely in our power, like our immediate choices, our current actions, our will, and what is outside our power, like the future, the actions of others, or abstract outcomes.
So the astronomer.
The astronomer is a perfect anti-Stoic. He is dedicating all of his cognitive bandwidth to the stars, things he cannot touch, alter, or control, while completely ignoring where he places his foot, which is the only thing he actually can control. The grasshopper, from the famous fable of singing all summer and starving all winter, suffers from a temporal blind spot. He focuses only on the immediate present pleasure, entirely blind to the inevitable, predictable future of winter. The fables demand a ruthless focus on practical reality.
I see the philosophical angle, but let's translate this to modern decision-making, because I can hear someone pushing back on this right now. The listener might be saying, look, this is an impossible standard. The stag only had 2 eyes, and one was physically blind. I only have so much cognitive bandwidth in a day. I cannot possibly run a threat assessment on the land, the sea, the sky, and the well simultaneously. If I spend my whole life looking at my feet to avoid wells, I'm never going to see the stars.
That is a very legitimate challenge. But if we look closely at the text, the fables are not demanding omniscience. They aren't telling you to magically predict every black swan event. The stag's fatal error was not the physical limitation of having a blind spot. His error was the arrogant assumption that his blind spot was inherently safe. He told himself a story. He said, danger only comes from the land. The sea is a null variable.
Wow, okay, yeah.
The psychological mechanism here is normalcy bias combined with confirmation bias. The stag looks at the land, sees a hunter, and says, aha, I was right to watch the land. He confirms his own hypothesis while remaining completely oblivious to the novel threat forming on the water. The lesson isn't to perfectly predict every threat. It is to remain deeply humble about what we do not know.
I love that distinction. The illusion of control is the actual danger, not the lack of control. Think about how we do this in business or personal finance. We see individuals or companies spend endless amounts of time reinforcing the front door while leaving the back door wide open because they assume no one walks around back.
Exactly.
The business analogy that always gets thrown around is a company obsessing over their traditional competitor while a new tech startup makes them obsolete. But I think a better analogy is military history. Think about the Maginot Line in World War II.
Oh, perfect example.
France built this incredibly sophisticated, heavily fortified defensive line along their border with Germany. They put all their resources, all their good eyes, on that specific stretch of land. But they left the Ardennes forest, relatively lightly defended, because their internal logic said, well, the forest is too dense. Tanks can't get through there. It's a natural barrier. They assumed the Ardennes was their sea.
And we all know how that ended.
So what happened? The German armor pushed right through the Ardennes, bypassed the massive fortifications entirely, and the French strategy collapsed. They were shot from the sea.
That is exactly the mechanism. We build elaborate, resource-intensive safety nets for the threats we understand and can model, which gives us a massive false sense of security. We then leave ourselves entirely exposed to the novel or the unmodeled threat because we've declared it safe. The wisdom Aesop is offering is to maintain a state of adaptable awareness. You don't have to stare at the sea all day, but you must constantly remind yourself, I am blind on that side, and danger can come from anywhere.
So here's how you apply this to your life today. I want you to ask yourself a very uncomfortable question. Where's your sea? What area of your life, your finances, your career, or your relationships have you labeled as so fundamentally secure, so untouchable, that you have intentionally turned your blind eye to it? Are you spending 100 hours optimizing a 1% return on your investment portfolio while ignoring a massive foundational crack in your marriage because you assume your spouse will, quote unquote, always be there?
That's a tough one to face.
It is, but you have to.
Huh.
Identify the area you've decided is inherently safe and recognize that your assumption of safety is exactly what makes it dangerous.
Acknowledging those vulnerabilities requires a lot of ego suppression, and that transitions us into what is perhaps the most uncomfortable blind spot for the modern mind to accept. Because while we might admit we can't see the future, we violently resist admitting how much we rely on others to survive the present.
Which brings us to the core of our next major theme, the economy of empathy and interdependence. The Fables in this section launch a direct assault on the concept of the self-made individual. The underlying wisdom is that we are entirely systematically dependent on one another. Selfishness, hoarding, and ingratitude don't just harm the community, they inevitably yield self-destruction.
To understand this, we have to look at Fable 164, the belly and the members. This is arguably one of the most famous and influential political metaphors in human history. We know from historical records that the Roman consul Menenius Agrippa actually used a version of this exact fable around 494 BC.
Wait, an actual Roman consul used this?
Yeah, he used it to quell a massive rebellion of the plebeians, the working class, who were threatening to abandon Rome and let the aristocratic patricians fend for themselves.
Oh.
The fable describes the members of the body. The hands, the feet, the mouth, the teeth. They all hold a council and decide they are sick of the belly. They look at the belly and say, you live in luxury and absolute sloth. You never do a single stroke of work. We do all the heavy lifting, we fetch the food, we chew it, and we are practically your slaves while you just sit there and consume. We are going on strike. Shift for yourself.
They decide to completely cut off the supply chain.
Exactly. The hands refuse to lift food, the mouth refuses to open, and the result is immediate and systemic. Within days, the hands grow weak and begin to tremble. The legs can no longer support the body's weight. The members realize, far too late, that the belly was not idle at all. Its quiet, unglamorous, internal processing of the food was the exact mechanism creating the blood and energy that kept the hands and feet alive. By starving the seemingly lazy belly, the members accidentally murdered themselves.
It perfectly illustrates how invisible labor sustains the whole system. But we see the dark, tragic cost of ignoring this interdependence in Fable 181, The Ass and the Mule. A man is traveling with an ass and a mule, and he's loaded both of them with heavy cargo. They hit a steep, treacherous mountain pass. The ass, who is smaller and weaker, hits his absolute physiological breaking point. He is gasping, stumbling, and he begs the stronger mule, please, just take a fraction of my load for this hill or I'm gonna die right here.
And the mule looks at him and flatly refuses.
Right.
He operates on pure, isolated self-interest. He thinks my load is my load, your load is your load. Because he refuses to offer that tiny margin of empathy, the ass finally collapses from sheer weariness, falls down a ravine, and dies.
Just terrible.
But now, look at the brutal economic consequence for the mule. The human driver still has to get all the goods to the market, so he climbs down, retrieves the entirety of the dead ass's cargo, and stacks it on top of the mule's existing load. Furthermore, because the driver doesn't want to lose the financial value of the dead animal, he flays the ass and throws the bloody heavy skin on top of the pile as well.
Oh my God.
The mule is left staggering under a crushing, impossible weight. Realizing his fatal error, he says, I have only got what I deserved. If I had been willing to help the ass carry a little bit first, I would not now be carrying his entire load plus his skin into the bargain.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the imagery of carrying the dead coworker's skin is so incredibly visceral. Let's apply this to modern corporate burnout, because the parallel is one-to-one. Think about a modern tech team, or a hospital ward, or a school faculty. You have one person who is absolutely drowning. They're the ass on the steep hill. They signal that they are at their breaking point. And a colleague, the mule, says, not my job, not my problem. I'm hitting my metrics, I'm protecting my boundaries.
Right.
What happens? The overwhelmed person completely burns out. They quit, or they go on long-term medical leave.
Yeah.
And what does management do? They don't magically hire a replacement the next day. They take that person's entire workload, plus the massive mess of their unfinished broken projects, the dead ass's skin, and they dump it on the remaining team members. The mule thought they were protecting their energy, but by refusing to share a small burden early on, they guaranteed their own systemic collapse later. If you don't help your coworker with a fraction of their load today, you will be doing their entire job tomorrow.
It's a brilliant breakdown of how localized selfishness creates macro-level disaster. However, this is where we must apply a very strict layer of discernment to the ancient text. The Fables do not advocate for naive, unbounded generosity. They understand that while interdependence is a law of nature, not all elements in nature are cooperative. Empathy without boundaries is just as suicidal as selfishness.
Yeah, you have to know who you are dealing with.
Precisely. We see the lethal consequence of misplaced generosity in Fable 189, the trees and the axe. A woodman walks into the forest and begs the trees for just one tiny favor. A single piece of wood to make a handle for his axe head? The trees, wanting to be generous and helpful, confer and offer him a young ash sapling.
And the second he fits the wood into the axe head, he turns around and starts chopping down the entire forest. The trees armed their own executioner.
The trees cry out, "We are ourselves to blame. The little we gave has cost us all." We see a similar dynamic in Fable 180, the sixth stag. A stag is ill and confined to a specific patch of grass. All of his animal friends hear he is sick and come to visit him to show their support. But they stay so long and they are so thoughtless that they end up eating all the grass surrounding him. When the stag finally starts to recover his strength, his food source is completely gone and he starves to death, killed by the proximity of his friends.
That one hits close to home.
And of course, the most blunt warning is Fable 160, the farmer and the viper. A farmer finds a viper in the winter, frozen stiff in the snow. Pity overcomes him. He picks up the deadly snake and places it inside his coat against his chest to warm it back to life. The moment the viper thaws out, its core nature returns and it strikes the farmer in the chest, delivering a fatal bite. The dying farmer's final realization is, kindness is thrown away upon the evil.
So the wisdom here requires intense nuance. The fables are telling us you must be deeply invested in your actual ecosystem, you must feed the belly, you must help the ass up the hill, but blindly giving your resources to natural enemies or thoughtless consumers, arming the woodman, warming the viper, feeding the friends of the sixth stag, is self-destruction. But here is why this is so hard for modern listeners to swallow. Our culture is completely obsessed with hyper-individualism.
Oh, totally.
The myth of the self-made billionaire, the lone genius, the solopreneur. If we trace the sociological mechanism back, the Industrial Revolution and modern capitalism completely severed us from the agrarian reality, where if the village didn't work together to harvest the wheat, everyone literally starved. We now have an economic system that allows us to believe we don't need anyone else. We hate the idea of the belly and the members because admitting we are just a hand that would wither and die without the invisible, unglamorous processing of the belly, it destroys our ego.
It shatters the illusion of absolute autonomy. And the fables argue that absolute autonomy is a myth that inevitably leads to starvation. Furthermore, translating the sixth stag to modern life gives us a terrifyingly accurate diagnostic for toxic empathy. Think about the phenomenon of emotional vampires in your personal life, or performative grief on social media.
Yeah.
When a tragedy happens, thousands of people flock to the comment sections to express their thoughts and prayers, to show how deeply they care. But their presence, their demand for emotional validation, often drains the actual victims. They consume the emotional and practical resources of the environment without offering any caloric return. True interdependence requires conscious, discerning action, not just showing up and eating the grass.
So let's make this actionable. I want you to look at the ecosystem of your life, your home or your organization, and identify your belly. Who is the seemingly passive entity or the unglamorous person whose underlying quiet processing actually keeps your daily life functioning? Maybe it's the administrative assistant who never gets on stage but manages the schedule so perfectly you never miss a meeting. Maybe it's a partner at home who handles the grinding logistics of the household so you can focus entirely on your career. Find your belly. Acknowledge that without them, you are a hand without a pulse. And figure out a concrete way to show them gratitude today before they decide to go on strike.
Identifying who truly supports us and setting fierce boundaries with vipers naturally forces us to examine the broader mechanics of how we associate with others. We think we are just navigating relationships, but Aesop points out that the world is actively judging our character based on those relationships. This brings us to the next critical theme, the danger of bad company, neutrality, and false alliances.
The core wisdom here is harsh, binary, and completely unforgiving. You are judged entirely by your associations. Attempting to play both sides makes you a universal outcast, and trusting manipulative rhetoric over historical reality leads to ruin.
Let's start with the sheer mechanics of reputation in Fable 156, the farmer and the stork. A farmer sets a vast array of nets in his newly planted fields to catch the cranes that have been systematically ruining his crops. He comes out the next morning and finds several cranes tangled in the trap, but he also finds a stork caught among them.
Wrong place, wrong time.
Exactly. The stork immediately pleads for his life, using what he thinks is a highly logical defense. He says, "Please, sir, look at my feathers. You can clearly see I am not a crane. I am a stork, a bird of excellent character. I honor my parents. I am harmless. I am objectively not the enemy.
And the farmer doesn't care at all about the stork's internal identity. The farmer's response is ice cold. He says, "It may be all as you say. I only know this. I have taken you with these robbers, the cranes, and you must die in their company." The moral is explicit. If you choose bad companions, the world will assume you share their nature, regardless of your personal defense.
The world does not have the time or the bandwidth to investigate your inner character. It uses your associations as a proxy for your character. We see this play out as a deliberate diagnostic tool in Fable 193, The Ass and His Purchaser. A man is at the market looking to buy an ass. He finds one he likes but insists on taking him home on trial before paying. He leaves the new ass back to his own stable, which is full of his other donkeys, and lets him loose to see how he behaves.
Okay, I love this test.
It's so smart. The newcomer looks around the stable, completely ignores all the hardworking, well-behaved donkeys, and immediately goes to stand next to the single laziest, greediest, most stubborn beast in the entire place. The purchaser doesn't need to see anything else. He immediately puts the halter back on the ass, leads him straight back to the market, and returns him to the owner. The owner is shocked and says, "How could you possibly have tested him so quickly?" And the purchaser replies, "I don't need to put him to work to test him. I could see exactly what sort of beast he is from the companion he chose for himself."
A man is known by the company he keeps. This is literally the origin of that concept. But the fables push deeper than just avoiding bad company. They tackle the modern obsession with avoiding any firm alliance. Look at Fable 171, The Birds, the Beasts, and the Bat. A massive, brutal war breaks out between the birds of the air and the beasts of the land. The bat, whose primary objective is just to survive without taking any damage, refuses to commit to a side. He wants to maintain ultimate flexibility.
Right.
When the battle shifts and it looks like the birds are winning, the bat flies around, spreading his wings and shouting, "Look at my wings, I'm a bird, I'm with you."
Yeah.
But when the tide turns and the beasts get the upper hand, the bat drops to the ground, crawls around and says, "Look at my teeth and my fur, I'm a beast, I belong with you."
It is the ultimate strategy of appeasement. But what happens when the war ends and peace is finally declared? Both sides review the bat's behavior. They realize he possesses zero loyalty. He is a double-faced opportunist. As a result, neither the birds nor the beasts will accept him into their society. He is universally condemned to be a solitary outcast, hiding in the dark forever.
I have to pause and ask you, the listener, right now, are you the bat? Because when I read this, my mind immediately went to modern office politics, or how people navigate highly polarized social environments today. There is a massive algorithmic and cultural incentive to never offend anyone, to never draw a line in the sand. People think that neutrality, or being a chameleon, is the safest possible strategy. They smile at the toxic boss, they agree with the complaining coworkers, they try to maintain 1,000 superficial connections on LinkedIn, assuming this flexibility protects them.
It's the illusion of safety through non-commitment. But if we trace this across broader comparative wisdom traditions, almost all ancient cultures, whether Greek, Near Eastern, or early Asian philosophies, held severe, uncompromising warnings against the double-minded. In a survival environment, a known enemy is vastly preferable to a fluid ally. When you refuse to stand for anything, you signal to the community that you will abandon them the moment it becomes mathematically advantageous. The bat thinks he is outsmarting the system, but the psychological cost of belonging to nothing is total isolation.
And the flip side of being the bat is being incredibly naive about the alliances we do make, which is Fable 187, the wolves and the dogs. The wolves, who want to eat the sheep, realize they can't defeat the guard dogs in a straight fight. So they use manipulative rhetoric. They come to the edge of the camp and say to the dogs, "Why are we enemies? We are biologically basically the same. The only difference is your lifestyle. You are enslaved to these humans who put heavy iron collars around your necks and feed you scraps and bones, while we live in total freedom. Throw off your collars, let us into the camp, hand over the flocks, and we will feast together as brothers."
It's a brilliantly constructed political lie. It appeals directly to the dogs' grievances and their desire for freedom. The dogs allow themselves to be persuaded by the rhetoric. They abandon their secure, albeit imperfect, structure. They trust their natural historical enemies. They accompany the wolves into the den to sign the treaty, and the absolute second they are inside, the wolves drop the facade, fall upon the dogs, and tear them to pieces. The ancient author's commentary is ruthless. Traitors richly deserve their fate.
How many times do we see this today? We get frustrated with the heavy collars of our current obligations. A demanding job, a flawed relationship, a strict budget, and a wolf comes along. Maybe it's a predatory competitor promising a massive, unrealistic salary, or a toxic partner who promises to liberate us from our boring responsibilities. They use our own grievances against us. We abandon our secure structures for the shiny promise of freedom, and we get torn to pieces the moment the leverage shifts.
We resist this wisdom because drawing firm boundaries feels limiting. To declare an alliance, to say, I stand with the birds and I will fight the beasts, means accepting that the beasts will attack you. But the fables remind us that refusing to choose a side doesn't protect you from the war, it just ensures you have no allies when the war is over.
So here is your practical reflection for this section. I want you to do a brutal, honest audit. Look at the 5 people you spend the most time with, your inner circle, your closest colleagues. If a purchaser were to evaluate your work ethic, your integrity, and your core character purely based on the behavior of those 5 people, what would they conclude about you? Would they buy you, or would they return you to the market immediately? Because whether you agree with the stork's defense or not, the trap snaps shut on you just as hard as it does on the cranes.
That audit of our associations brings us to a fascinating underlying friction point. If you look at all these conflicts, the farmer and the storks, the wolves and the dogs, the bat-shifting sides, they all fundamentally stem from a clash over what is considered valuable. And this leads us perfectly into our final major theme, the subjectivity of value and competing realities.
The core wisdom here fundamentally disrupts how we argue and how we plan. The fables argue that value is not an inherent property of an object. It is entirely subjective to the perceiver. One person's absolute ideal condition is another person's complete ruin. And true wisdom requires accepting this multiplicity of reality without trying to force a universal standard.
Let's look at the clearest distillation of this in Fable 154, the cock and the jewel. A rooster is scratching around in the dirt looking for food, and he uncovers a precious, flawlessly cut jewel that someone dropped in the yard. He stares at it, recognizing its objective rarity. He says, "You're a fine thing, and your human owner would be absolutely thrilled to find you. But for me, I would choose a single grain of corn over all the jewels in the world."
It's such a pure economic statement. The diamond is objectively valuable in the human framework, but functionally useless and actually a distraction to the rooster whose biological imperative is calories.
We see a much more complex and painful version of this subjective reality in Fable 200, the father and his daughters. A man has 2 daughters. One is married to a gardener who grows vegetables for a living. The other is married to a potter who makes clay vessels and leaves them in the sun to bake. The father goes to visit the gardener's wife, asks how she is doing, and she says, "Everything is wonderful, but I have one desperate prayer. I wish the gods would send some good heavy rain. The garden wants it badly, or our crops will fail."
That makes perfect sense. So he leaves and goes to visit the potter's wife. He asks how she's doing. She says, "We have nothing to complain of, but I do have one desperate prayer. I wish the gods would send some nice, hot, dry weather to bake our pottery, or our business will fail."
The father is paralyzed by the inherent contradiction of the universe. He realizes he cannot act. He tells her, "You want dry weather, and your sister desperately needs rain. I was going to ask the gods in my prayers that your wishes should be granted, but now it strikes me I had better not refer to the subject at all."
So what does this all mean? Does this mean there is no objective truth? Does everyone just get their own reality and we can't ever make a definitive decision because someone's pottery will get ruined?
That is the exact trap we fall into. The fables aren't saying reality isn't objective, the rain is objectively wet, the jewel is objectively hard. They are saying utility is subjective.
Yeah.
The universe is not tailored to our specific ego-driven definitions of success. If we fail to understand this, we end up like the physician in Fable 168, the sick man and the doctor.
Oh, this one is rough.
It is. A doctor visits a critically ill patient. The patient says, "Doctor, I sweat a great deal." The doctor nods confidently and says, "Ugh, that's a good sign." The next visit, the patient says, "Doctor, I have severe, violent shivering fits." The doctor checks his charts and says, "Ah, a good sign too." On the third visit, the patient is burning with a high fever. The doctor says, "A very good sign. You are doing nicely." Shortly after, a friend comes to visit the patient and asks how he is recovering. The patient delivers this dark, tragic punchline, "My dear friend, I am dying of good signs."
Dying of good signs. That phrase is haunting.
It perfectly illustrates the danger of subjective metrics. The doctor is completely blinded by his own medical framework. In his subjective model, perhaps sweat and fever indicated the body's immune system was fighting back. But he became so obsessed with his metrics, his jewels, that he completely ignored the overarching objective reality. The patient was dying.
If we translate this to the modern world, this is a perfect explanation of Goodhart's law. Goodhart's law states that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. We see companies dying of good signs every single day. The leadership team is in a boardroom, popping champagne because all their key performance indicators are green. The engagement metrics are up, the click-through rates are hitting record highs. In their subjective framework, they are experiencing a fever of good signs. But they are completely ignoring the fact that the actual product is degrading, customer trust is gone, and the employees are completely burned out. The company is dying, but the spreadsheets look fantastic.
And we do the exact same thing in our personal lives. We set arbitrary targets, a specific salary, a job title, a certain zip code, because society tells us these are jewels. We sacrifice our sleep, our relationships, and our peace of mind to achieve these metrics. We collect all the good signs, but we are fundamentally starving because what our biology and our psychology actually needed to survive was corn.
The major obstacle to growth here is that we despise the father and daughter's fable. We want a frictionless universe where every choice has a universally positive outcome. We hate acknowledging that our success often requires someone else's inconvenience, or that achieving a career milestone might inherently require sacrificing time at home. Ancient wisdom forces us to accept tragedy, inherent conflict, and trade-offs.
Which is why we have to learn to use reality as a tool rather than a weapon against ourselves. Take Fable 182, brother and sister. A father has a very handsome son and a very plain daughter. They are playing together and find a mirror. The handsome boy looks in it and immediately starts boasting about his physical superiority. The plain girl looks in it, is devastated by the comparison, and feels deeply insulted by her brother's arrogance.
Classic sibling rivalry.
The father intervenes, and he provides an incredible framework for dealing with unequal reality. He doesn't take the mirror away. He tells them both to use the reflection constructively. He tells the boy to strive to make his inner character as good and noble as his outward appearance, so he isn't just a hollow shell. He tells the girl to resolve to make up for her plainness with the exceptional sweetness and strength of her disposition.
Now, obviously, a modern listener is going to immediately flinch at the ancient social packaging here. The blatant lookism, the sexism of defining a girl's worth by her physical plainness and telling her to just be sweet. We should absolutely push back on that framework.
Without question. The ancient social assumptions are highly problematic. But if we use discernment to filter out the cultural bias, the enduring psychological mechanism underneath is profoundly empowering. The fable is about self-awareness in the face of an inherently unequal universe. The fables urge us to use the mirror of reality, whether it reflects massive advantage or severe disadvantage, not as an excuse to boast and not as a reason to despair. You cannot control if you are born the handsome brother or the plain sister, just as you cannot control if your crops need rain or sun. The only variable in your control is how you respond to the reflection. You use whatever reality hands you as raw material to cultivate inner character.
It's about radical acceptance of the reality you actually inhabit, rather than screaming at the mirror because you wish you had a different reflection. So here's your final practical application for this deep dive. I want you to ask yourself honestly, are you hoarding jewels when you are starving for corn? Look at where you are spending your primary time and energy. Are you chasing subjective metrics of success, a title, a social media following, a specific aesthetic that do not actually sustain your daily life? Redefine your actual needs today. Figure out what your corn is and go get that. Let someone else have the diamond.
When you look at this entire stack of fables in aggregate, they systematically strip away our modern illusions. They demand that we look at the world and ourselves with unflinching honesty. They remind us that our fundamental nature cannot be hacked, that our arrogant blind spots are lethal, that we survive only through deep interdependence with others, that our chosen company defines us to the world, and that value is merely a matter of perspective.
It is a massive amount of psychological weight to process. But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your week. It's drawn from Fable 170, The Flea and the Ox, and it perfectly encapsulates the tension of the modern world.
That's a great one to end on.
A tiny flea sits on the horn of a massive ox and starts boasting. "I am so infinitely superior to you," the flea says. "You do all the heavy grinding work for mankind. You pull their plows, you carry their massive loads, you sweat all day in the sun. Meanwhile, I do zero work. I live right on their bodies, I drink my fill of their blood whenever I want, and I never lift a finger. I am the ultimate optimizer."
You're the original biohacker.
Exactly. The ox listens to this, shakes his heavy head, and replies, "Men are kind to me because I am useful and grateful to them. They feed me grain, they build me a warm house, and they pat me affectionately on the head." The flea scoffs and says, "If they patted me, I'd be crushed instantly. I have to hide in the dark just to ensure there's anything left of me." Think about that in the context of our modern age of hyper-extraction. We see endless content teaching people how to be the flea, how to extract maximum value from a system, an employer, or a relationship without offering any real caloric value in return. The flea is incredibly proud of this hack. But the hidden cost is that the flea must live its entire life hiding in the dark, universal hated, knowing it will be crushed on sight the moment it is discovered. The ox works hard, yes, it carries a heavy load. But the ox is loved, housed, protected, and integrated into the community. If you design your life purely to extract blood without pulling the plow, you will eventually find yourself with no allies, hiding from the very hands that could have fed you. That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.